Hello and welcome, everyone. Senator Richard Lugar from Indiana has actually distinguished himself in several ways, but two of perhaps the most important are the fact that he is a statesman, the way he behaves and conducts business on Capitol Hill, and also the fact that he is a world-renowned expert on international affairs. He's someone people of both political parties, as well as non-elected officials, go to for input and advice about international issues, and IPFW has chosen to recognize him for this by creating the Lugar Scholars Program. Each year, one student and one faculty member are chosen as the Lugar Scholars, and the faculty member, a year after they are done doing the research plan that they proposed, comes and gives a talk to us. This year, that person is Ann Lifshitz. She was the Lugar Scholar from last academic year, and she's here to give you, I think, what will be an interesting talk, but before she does, I have a couple of things to say. Ann actually is an assistant professor from the Department of History here at IPFW, and I'm happy to say earlier, I believe it was this week, we all received a little announcement that said Ann actually next year will be known as an associate professor because she was tenured and promoted, so give her a round of applause for that. Ann went up for tenure and promotion based on research, but she is a good example of how students or how faculty members in IPFW or at IPFW have to be thinking about not only research but also teaching and service. She is very dedicated to her students. She's also very dedicated to governance, faculty governance, and other issues here at IPFW that require the service of faculty members. So Ann is a wonderful example of how those three things come together, and today she will inform and entertain us with several examples of comic books that we will all run out to buy shortly. Right, Ann?
Right.
Ann Lifshitz, everybody.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that very, very generous and kind introduction. I almost am afraid to go on because this would be a lovely place to stop on a very, very high note. I want to thank the Mike Downs Center and of course Professor Downs, who runs the Lugar Scholar Program, for this wonderful opportunity. And I also want to thank the student scholar, Lugar scholar Travis Barnes, who of course is in law school now, for his help on this project. So the title of my talk today is Common Ground for Ideological Rivals, the Anti-Comics Crusades in the United States and the Soviet Union During the Cold War. This project is kind of an experiment in a number of ways. It's probably the least depressing project I've ever worked on, with the lowest death toll possible, and so which makes me a tiny bit nervous. I guess I feel more comfortable when there's a greater death toll. It was also an experiment for me to try to learn to define my projects more narrowly rather than watch them sort of grow and explode. It was also an opportunity for me to try to think more comparatively, and in particular venture out of my comfort zone of Soviet history and dabble a little in U.S. history. And of course, the presence of so many U.S. history faculty fills me with mild dread as to how they might feel about the encroachment on their territory from a Soviet historian, although I guess in the context of the Cold War, perhaps it's in a weird way actually appropriate. So the origin of this project is when I was doing my dissertation research on Soviet childhood, I came across a number of anti-comic statements, and sort of I filed them away as mildly interesting. But as I started to think more comparatively about my approach to the study of Soviet childhood, I came across information from from the United States, where apparently there was a fair amount of vilification of comics going on in the 1940s and 1950s. As well. And so this was sort of the impetus for this project. So as the Cold War gathered momentum and the need for battle readiness and ideological and moral purity was becoming increasingly paramount in both the United States and the Soviet Union in the late 40s, early 1950s, both superpowers found themselves becoming increasingly concerned about the behavior and ideological preparedness of their children and young people. As politicians, cultural figures, and other moral guardians in the Soviet Union and the United States searched for causes and scapegoats to the moral crisis in their respective society, remarkably, both sides discovered the same target: American comics. Now, of course, I should immediately say that obviously there were many other scapegoats that both sides could find for what was ailing young people at that time. And so I certainly don't want to say that this was seen as the sole reason for all of the problems in both of those societies. But the focus today is going to be on the comics. And so while prominent Soviet writers railed against comics on the pages of literary newspapers in the Soviet Union or attacked them in their speeches at the Congress of the Writers' Union, American comics were actually put on trial, perhaps even a show trial, I dare say, in the presence of Professor Schneider, at hearings at the U.S. Senate. So what was it about comic books during the late 40s and early 50s that drew the ire of two superpowers that viewed each other as mirror opposites? And what was it about the ideological, political, and cultural climate of the United States and the Soviet Union during this early phase of the Cold War that found them in such a similar situation? And so I'm going to start dangerously with the United States side, and of course the U.S. side historiography on comic books in the 1940s and 50s and 60s and 70s is obviously much, much more developed. And so I'm not gonna spend too much time on it, and I want to say a couple of general things, and then talk in particular about Frederick Wertham. So already even before World War II, but especially in the 1940s, there was broad concern among some in the United States about the decadence of content and the inculcation of racism and fascism in American comic books. There was concern that parents were losing control. There was concern about that the comics reflected the moral decadence of America. Articles such as "What's Wrong with Comics," being published regularly. There were even some comic book burnings organized in the late 1940s, although it was decided that perhaps that would actually promote authoritarianism and have a negative impact on democracy, and therefore was not seen as the best way of combating that sort of problem. And so the name that's most commonly associated with the anti-comics crusade is Frederick Wertham. He was a German-born psychiatrist who came to the United States in 1922, and eventually he became the chief resident in charge of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins University. Criminal behavior was his specialty. In 1934, he moved to New York City to serve as the head of the Court of General Sessions Psychiatric Clinic, which gave him access to a lot of convicted felons in the city. He worked in a variety of hospitals, and in 1946, he opened a clinic in Harlem, which charged 25 cents if the patient could afford it, which basically was the first free psychiatric facility in the United States for people of color. And this is going to be significant because, of course, as we talk about his arguments, we're going to see the way his arguments have been taken out of context and ridiculed. And so it's very, very important, before we make fun of him for his anti-comics crusade, we appreciate where he was coming from and the background and his background. So he's, as far as Wertham is concerned, he saw comics as having a very damaging effect on juvenile delinquents. And it's important to know that, again, he's not the first one to raise these concerns, but up until then, most of the discussions are taking place within the psychiatric community. There's some who feel that comics are dangerous, people who feel that they provide children, at best, they provide children with a distorted view of life. There's a story about a little boy who got a Superman cape, for his birthday. He draped himself in the cape. He jumped out of of his apartment window because he thought he could fly, and of course the little boy died. And this is the example that everybody sort of mentions as the best case scenario, right? Because at least he only harmed himself, as opposed to all those who, of course, are going to for whom the comics launch them on a life of crime that will, of course, then damage others. The kind of, just a sample kind of title of articles: Comic Books and Other Horrors, Prep School for Totalitarian Society. I mean, these are the articles that are being published. At the same time, though, not everybody agrees. And this is where things get very interesting, because there's a lively and spirited debate within the psychiatric community about whether or not they're in fact damaging. The only problem is that many people who argue that there's really nothing wrong with comics and they're perfectly safe, these are people who are actually being paid by the publishing houses of these comics, and so this is which raises some questions about a lot of things, including, of course, ethics. And so when Wertham discovers that he is not really being able to find a receptive audience within the scholarly community, he basically takes his message to the public, and after he publishes a number of scholarly articles in peer reviews, journals, he then converts his argument and publishes in multiple popular journals, right? Some titles: Horror in the Nursery, What Are Comic Books, What Parents Don't Know About Comic Books, and then, of course, most famously, his book Seduction of the Innocent in 1954. A condensed version of his book was printed in Reader's Digest. It was under the title Blueprints for Delinquency, and it was a Book of the Month Club selection for June 1954. And again, I'm giving all these details just to give an idea that this is not perhaps quite rare for a scholar. He is, in fact, reaching a very wide popular audience and is contributing to the shaping of the discourse about juvenile delinquency in comics in the United States at that time. So what is his concern? Basically, he thinks that the comics depict crime in every setting imaginable, and he differentiates between the comic strips in the newspapers that are subject to various censorship and editorial provisions, and then the comics that are published in kind of standalone editions that have absolutely no control over them whatsoever. And it's very easy to sort of to mock him for having this kind of simplistic view of juvenile delinquency, although he's often depicted as having said that it causes juvenile delinquency. He actually said it contributes, which obviously is a very, very different thing. So I just want to kind of give you an idea of a couple of areas of his concern, and I'm going to show some images of some of the comics that he was so worried about. He believed that comics contained a tremendous amount of violence for violence sake, that the crime comics were increasing in popularity. 46, 47, 1/10 of all the comic books are about crime. 48, 49, 1/3. 1949, 50, half. By 1954, the vast majority deal with crime, sort of broadly construed. The concern about how crime is depicted. Every imaginable kind of crime is described in detail. If one was to, this is a quote, if one were to set out to show children how to steal, rob, lie, cheat, assault, and break into houses, no better method could be devised. Instructions on how to commit crime, instruction on how to conceal evidence, instructions on how to evade detection. And he makes the point that, of course, most children are not going to commit a robbery, but they can use similar strategies to, shoplift and commit various other smaller scale crimes. Illustrations for how to commit murder for profit, including going rates for the kinds of injuries, how much you have to pay to get certain injuries inflicted on people, how to set fires, how to steal, including, for example, women's pocketbooks. The description of crimes with tremendous detail, the daring and success of criminals, brutal acts showed in detail, sordid details emphasized, sexual details featured, lots of pictures of half-nude women. And then it gets even more, in some ways, interesting, because then he points to the fact that the crime settings are not just in American urban areas, but they're in various exotic locales. And once the crime moves from American urban areas elsewhere, a new set of problems arises. The heroes are white, blonde, athletic men. There are kind of women next to them, quote, well or overdeveloped girls in brasiers and as little else as possible. Natives are depicted as somewhere between apes and human beings. Dark-skinned people are characterized as subhuman. And I'll show you that in just a second. He had issues with superheroes because he felt that the distinction was being drawn between superheroes and sub-people. Sub-people tended to be foreigners. The concern about the sort of the projection of superheroes, where he saw superhero comics as, quote, presenting our world in a kind of fascist setting of violence and hate and destruction. And he was worried about the kind of impact this was having on children. So let me show you, I guess maybe we will conduct an experiment since we do have young people in the audience. And so before I show you these images again, I just want to make it I want to make it clear that, and this is part of the problem in talking about sort of this assault and the crusade against comics and the problem of talking about Wortham, is that in retrospect it seems so ridiculous, because when we think comics, we think, cuddly animals and Archie and these various other things that we associate with 1950s. The problems he was having was not quite with Archie. And so here are some examples, right? So here you have both the depiction of women and some tiny natives on the bottom there. Sort of women, the projection of sexual violence. Even sort of the really, really exotic locales. This is, somewhere in space, and even there is this kind of pornographic element to it. Here's sex and violence. I don't know if you can see, but there's a woman with her clothes being ripped off, kind of being manhandled. Here are some Native Americans depicted in a unflattering light. And here are some military comics depicting acts of military. Now, if you can see this image right here. That's actually a sympathetic character in this particular cartoon. From my understanding, he's the sidekick of the American hero in this, and this is how he is depicted. And here's another one. So this is his concern, and he was worried the impact that this was having on young people. And again, this is kind of part of a broader problem. Younger and younger people were apparently committing crimes in the early 1950s. There were people in society who were concerned, why is this happening? As far as Wortham is concerned, he, having talked to lots and lots and lots of juvenile delinquents, it appears that they all told him that they got all their ideas from comic books, that they did the things they did because they've been reading comic books since they were very young, and that's where they picked up all of their tips. In addition to the sort of this impetus to crime, Wortham was also concerned that comics led to psychological maladjustment and preoccupation with crime and violence, that children would imitate comics and this would lead to accidents and death, that comics distorted children's view of reality, that the Superman ideology where the strong dominates the weak is a problematic one, that children believe that colored people and foreign-born are inferior, that they either acquire prejudice from comics or their existing prejudices are reaffirmed in the comics. There's differences in the way white women and non-white women are depicted in these comics. So lots of racial and gender stereotypes. Women are depicted as sexual objects or possessions by men. The comics teach sadism, eroticism, and sexual violence. That the love crime stories help lay the groundwork for childhood prostitution, both for girls and also for boys who start selling themselves to men for money. That comics promote homosexuality because they teach boys contempt for girls. The best example he had was Batman and Robin, where I think the quote is, "Only someone ignorant of the fundamentals of psychiatry and of the psychopathology of sex can fail to realize a subtle atmosphere of homoeroticism which pervades the adventures of the mature Batman and his young friend Robin." And sort of in going on to explain that there are no women there are no women except for Catwoman, who has a whip and is presented as this threatening figure. That when they're not fighting crime, they're in this delightfully decorated home, sort of sitting on a couch together and kind of appearing to lead this very nice domestic life and in fact, all the boys that he was at the time treating for homosexuality all turned out to be fans of Batman and were reading Batman and Robin. For girls, there's also Wonder Woman, who also presents a deeply problematic image of womanhood to emulate, and of course, not what a proper woman should be, and contributes to development of homosexuality in young women. And if all of that is not bad enough, comic books also promote reading difficulties because children who are raised on comics refuse to read more complicated things. The plots in these stories are very poor. The writing is very poor, and this is this is having a very damaging effect. Now, you remember some of these arguments, because when we get to the Soviet Union, we'll see that there are a lot of fascinating similarities there. And then the last straw, the ads in the comic books, they are for things like breast enlargement, they're for things like weight loss for girls, weight muscle gain for boys, sort of the obsession with appearance, making children feel bad about the way they look in an effort to sell them products that will make them look differently. So it appears the situation is quite dire. If we turn to the Soviet side, here the situation is also very, very dire. And I need to give a little bit more context here. The Soviet regime was absolutely obsessed with the loyalty of its citizens in general and young people in particular, right? Young people, the future of the revolution. If we lose them, the revolution will die. At the same time, this is also a regime that places a tremendous amount of importance on the role that culture plays in general, and literature in particular, on inculcating appropriate values and world outlook in general population and especially in children. And so there's this tremendous concern about young people in the late 40s, early 50s, what are they reading? I mean, there's a broader concern as well, but if we're focusing on reading, what are they reading? Are they reading appropriate things? And it may seem like a strange question to ask in the Soviet context. How is it possible that there's something to read in the Soviet Union that's not actually appropriate? And this is where, sort of behind the facade of uniformity, there are some interesting things going on in the cultural sphere. There's still some leftover pre-revolutionary literature that was printed on really good paper with really good binding that has survived into the 1940s, and it gets passed around And that's a problem. In the 20s, there were still books being published that were not anti-Soviet in nature, but rather they perhaps were devoid of, they were too fluffy and sort of devoid of political message, and thus eventually problematic for the regime, but still okay to be published by non-state run publishing houses, which of course disappear by the late 20s. There's also debates within the educational establishment about what constitutes proper literature. Are fairy tales okay? Are adventure stories okay? Who should be the protagonist? Who shouldn't be the protagonist? And again, depending on how that question is answered and by whom, the list of what's appropriate and what's not appropriate changes. And then the last, and definitely not least, the point that perhaps may not seem obvious for the Soviet context, but there's also the need to make money. Publishing houses have to produce books that are going to be bought, and fluffy books, adventure stories, and so on, have a tendency to be sold much better than some of the other more appropriate literature. And so you have this kind of tension. On the one hand, the need to, the need to make, to fulfill the plan, and the desire by writers to make money, at the same time as their deep ideological sort of apprehension about, giving the wrong things to read to children and being a part of that particular process. And it's important to know that it's not just government officials who have concerns about this. This is also literary figures as well, right? Why are they so interested? Well, they have been proclaimed to be engineers of human souls. They see it as by Stalin himself, right? So they see it as their special responsibility to create works that are going to positively shape young people. And they're very protective of this power. And so there are very interesting battles within the literary establishment about who is allowed and who's not allowed to decide what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. There's kind of the core of Soviet children's writers who feel Soviet and kind of confident enough in their Soviet credentials that they feel that they don't have to ask permission, right? They get to decide, and they get to tell other writers, especially younger ones, whether or not they're allowed to publish or write the way that they the way that they're writing. Fundamentally, right, it's the resentment about the possibility that children are acquiring literacy and not reading them. Right? And this is, of course, a very common phenomenon. I mean, we see that, the earliest example I can think of is the Enlightenment, right? Where you have sort of the Enlightenment figures who are so excited about the spread of literacy and grossly disappointed, right? That the people learn to read and they read, well, frankly, pornographic stories rather than these kind of very important works, written by Enlightenment philosophers. And so, but there's one more thing that needs to be added to the Soviet side, and that's kind of the traditional, even before the 1917 revolution, apprehension within among the Russian cultural elite about influences from abroad. There's a sense of the tension between belief that their culture is superior to all others, and therefore they don't really need to learn or borrow from anybody else, and the anxiety that somehow, if the Western influences can penetrate the country, that they might be able to sort of sway the weak-minded and the inexperienced. And the Bolsheviks, they build on that existing tradition with an extra ideological dimension, right? Western influences are dangerous, not just because they're coming from the outside, but they're seen as intentionally dangerous, right? Western cultural products are designed by the U.S., well, obviously during the Cold War by the U.S. government to infiltrate the Soviet Union and distract the people of the Soviet Union, especially young people, from all the things that they really were supposed to be doing. And this is, it's important to know that, of course, this is not purely Soviet paranoia. Right? Because obviously the cultural sphere was a very important battle of the Cold War. This is where, on the one hand, where we see the distinction between high culture and low culture really become really significant. The Soviets felt that they actually had a shot at winning the culture wars. Right? They felt that their high culture was better than anybody else's, and they could actually win. But they were very much concerned because they couldn't compete with low culture or pop culture. They saw it as inferior, but they were also worried about kind of the deep attraction it seemed to hold for so many people. And kind of parenthetically, it's very important to note that, of course, the Soviets are not the only ones in the aftermath of World War II who are deeply ambivalent about American cultural products, especially American popular culture. We see this in Western, I'm sure we can see it in other parts of the world, but if we just, if we remain Eurocentric for a moment, Western Europe, the countries kind of firmly in the non-Soviet camp are also very ambivalent about what the influx of American culture, both, consumer goods and books, including comics, what that actually means for their native culture, and whether or not there's a risk that kind of that this American cultural imperialism could destroy their native cultural traditions. Of course, both the Soviet government and the Soviet writers assume that these books are written by people who are employed by the government, right? They work for them, in a sense. I mean, they're projecting their own experience onto the United States. So, of course, they're assuming that it's the same in the United States, and this is where sort of, just because the Soviets are paranoid doesn't mean somebody's not out to get them. Because certainly, obviously, American culture is much more complicated than simply suggesting that everybody in the United States who's producing cultural products is working for the U.S. government. However, the United States government was, in fact, hiring people and funding all sorts of cultural programs. There were comics printed by the U.S. military to be distributed among the U.S. military. There were a number of other organizations, for example, Radio Free Europe, which was supposed to be private, but eventually was revealed that, of course, it was funded by the CIA, which, as you can imagine, the Soviets had a field day with, but they could project, see, we were right all along. We said it was the government, you kept denying it, but really, this proves, and so you can kind of extend it from radio and into every, absolutely every other sphere. I should say that, not all, that during the war there were actually some pro-Soviet comics in the United States. In particular, there were some dealing with small American children who joined, who went to the Eastern Front and helped open the Second Front far earlier than it actually was in real life, and are heroically fighting the Nazis on the Eastern Front. And it's interesting because, of course, from the Soviet point of view, they would see this as so deeply problematic because it depicts young children as being able to take on the German military, and obviously kind of trivializes the Soviet war effort, which would make it, deeply. So even the sympathetic ones are deeply problematic, to say nothing of all the of all the other ones. So what's the problem with the comics? Well, the genre itself is a problem, right? Bad language, bad simplistic stories, explicit sex and violence in the comics, racism, right? I mean, essentially all the things that that Wertham pointed to in these comics, the Soviets also see as deeply as deeply problematic, and it's interesting because, of course, for those professionals in the Soviet Union who are actually dealing with juvenile delinquency, for them, in their professional discussions, they don't actually talk about comics, right? Because there's a range of very concrete, serious problems that they recognize as contributing to the rise in juvenile delinquency in the Soviet Union. But for cultural figures, for them and their belief in the power of literature and the importance of literature, both good and bad, they saw the comics as a kind of an American crusade against not just against the Soviet Union, but actually kind of against the world, the world more broadly. And it's interesting because, of course, the question that you might be asking is who's reading the comics in the Soviet Union? Well, actually nobody pretty much is, right? I mean, they're not actually distributed in the Soviet Union. There might be a few here and there sort of trickling through, as a result of maybe, somebody exchanging them with an American soldier during the war, and maybe it makes its way in. Children of diplomats may bring some in. But really, this is not a mass phenomenon in any in any way whatsoever. And in some ways, it makes it even better because even though they can't be, they're not going to be widely used to blame, to be responsible for all of Soviet social ills, they're still a great tool to condemn American society and culture and demonstrate the depravity of American culture and society. Right? The comics fit perfectly the Soviet worldview that American culture is, there isn't American culture, right? That it's, that it's depraved, that it's that it's violent, that it really has no kind of, that it has absolutely no merit whatsoever. And that it has very, very kind of potentially very, very dangerous, dangerous consequences. And so there, kind of every so often, there's an article in the Literary Gazette. And the titles appear to be always the same. It's always the corruption / seduction / decay, kind of a mixture of those three, of children's souls. It changes. It's either that of children's souls or of American children, right? But the kind of what's being done to those souls remains the same. what comics are they concerned about? Well, they're concerned with a full range, right? They're concerned with the superheroes, right? Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman. What are some problems? Glorification of criminals. Question about how bad must crime in the United States be that they have to rely on superheroes in order to be able to combat them, right? This clearly is a sign that this is kind of a depraved society, right, on the verge of collapse, producing these depraved cultural products. That children grow up reading these, and they grow up as connoisseurs of violence. They are, what does it say about a society that promotes criminals as its heroes? It mentions the fact that psychiatrists who say they're okay get money from the, from the publishers. In 1954, there are articles when talking about the U.S. Senate hearings about it. They refer to the hearings as a farce, right? This is a way for the U.S. government to give the concerned Americans sort of, make them feel like something is being done about their concern, when of course in reality nothing is ever going to be done about any of this. And the implication behind all of these concerns is basically this is not just about sort of how a reflection on American culture. This is not just a reflection on America. This also has very dire consequences. Young Americans who read these comics then of course grow up, join the military, and kind of rape and pillage their way through the world in the context of the Cold War. And of course, in the in the early 50s, it's the Korean War that provides plenty of examples. Later on, it's going to be the Vietnam War and various others. So there's some as far as the Soviets are concerned, they're not very particularly nuanced. If Fortham is kind of trying to be more nuanced about the connection, as far as the Soviets are concerned, this is a straight line, right? You read these comics, you grow up to be a murderous American soldier, killing innocent civilians in Korea. How do we solve this problem? To go back for a second to the United States, in the United States, the problem was solved in a variety of different ways. We have the infamous hearings. The second set of the hearings in the U.S. Senate take place at the time when Wortham's book comes out. He's invited to testify. He's not super happy about it. He doesn't actually think that the U.S. Senate is taking this particularly seriously, but he does testify. He talks about, he makes these very kind of provocative statements like Hitler was a beginner compared to the comic book industry. They get the children much younger. They teach them race hatred at the age of 4 before they can read. So this is kind of he's very, very dramatic in his statements. And the thing about the trial, again, in some ways it sounds utterly ridiculous, although perhaps not equally ridiculous as having hearings about music in the 90s or, baseball in the whatever we are in right now. But part of the problem is that some of the participants in the hearings, like, for example, Senator Estes Kefauver, he's somebody who was earlier presiding over the much more serious organized crime hearings. So there's a sense that here's a very important person who is relatively well known, and here he is again. So it lends this kind of aura of credibility and seriousness to the proceedings. In the end, in addition to Wortham, some of the representatives from the comic book industry are invited as well, and they don't make for particularly good. They don't do a very good job on the stand. In particular, here's another crime one. This is, there's this very famous, and people who've studied this, I'm sure are aware of this exchange where one of the publishers is invited to, and he's asked, whether there are any limits to what he, as a publisher of horror comics, would circulate to children. And he says that the only limits are those of his own good taste. And then, dramatically, this cover is put forward, and he's asked, do you think this is in good taste? And he says, of course it is in good taste for a crime, cover, because if it was in bad taste, then the head would be higher and blood would be dripping, all over. But see, it's not. And you can imagine, right, that this kind of puts an end to the ability of the comic industry to come off looking particularly good out of this situation. So as far as who destroyed comic books, most of the publishers agreed to establish a comic book code. For example, from that point on, Superman would work more closely with police authorities. Batman and Robin would spend more time with girls. Wonder Woman would spend more time with Steve, and government officials would be depicted in a much more positive way from that point on. Very Soviet, as far as kind of solving problems. In the end, probably what killed comics was really not the comic code or the hearings or Wortham, but TV, right? I mean, sort of, essentially comics become irrelevant just as the time as they try to reform themselves and kind of reestablish themselves. They are pushed, you know, kind of out of relevance by a new medium. The really interesting thing to note is that even though there was some concern that the commies were behind the bad comics, right? Clearly, this must be some plot to destroy the kind of the mores of American youth. It did not prevent other concerned groups in the United States to use comics as a tool to fight against communism. And so it's interesting that violence and horror in comics were seen as tools used by the communists to destroy America, but you also then have violence be depicted as a cure, right, for communism in the comics that did pass the code. And I'll just show you some images. I mean, you have sort of the depictions of Khrushchev. This is not actually a comic, but it was just it was too perfect to, it was too much of a perfect fit to not use. I'll go back to this one just so that we don't end up with that as the backdrop for me. For me talking. Interestingly enough, right, for example, the Godless Communism comes from Treasure Chest, which is actually not a U.S. government publication, but it's a Catholic Church publication. And in some, there were also some kind of anti-communist, trading cards sold with gum. And you can imagine from the Soviet point of view, right, I mean, this is sort of, this is the epitome of all that is wrong with America, right? A combination of anti-communism and consumer culture, right, fusing together to create this, this particular product. So, what are some of the similarities that we notice? Well, in both cases, in the United States and in the Soviet Union, the attack on comics reflected the deep anxieties of the two regimes. For the United States, there was fear that children were becoming desensitized to violence. Right? That the violence would become a permanent feature of the reception of new commercial culture for kids. In the Soviet Union, right, this is about a fear of the power of American commercial popular culture, something that the Soviet Union, as I already mentioned, had in common with other parts of the world. And it's interesting that kind of exploring this anti-comics crusades in both countries really gives an indication of the similarity between the two in that both have this very uneasy relationship between commercialism and youth culture. Right? The two ideological rivals have grave concerns about the two and how the two are going to interact. There are a couple of other things that that I want to. That I want to very briefly mention, right? This is the concern about the fact that this is going to ruin children's taste, right? This is something that we see in both cases. There's a hint of this kind of crisis of masculinity also in both societies. The concerns about what this means for kind of the ability to articulate a proper kind of male role models for young people. There's also kind of an interesting similarity, and again, this is something that I haven't been able to find too much information about, but it seems like it can't possibly be a coincidence because right as the Soviet regime is raging against comics, it's also internally raging against various rages against cosmopolitanism, which is basically sort of code for Jews. And so, and given the fact that a lot of Jewish artists and there were a lot of Jewish artists and publishers involved in the comics, I can't help but wonder if there was some connection there. Although most of the Jews who were involved in comics changed their names, so they wouldn't necessarily be obviously Jewish. And so it's not clear to me. I haven't seen any evidence that in the Soviet Union they actually were aware of that or not. But it just seems like potentially a very interesting similarity. The similarity breaks down in a couple of places. In the Soviet Union, we don't have the public outrage that we have in the United States, precisely because they're not really an issue for the vast majority of the population. It doesn't really become a mass campaign the way it does in the United States. Although it's clear that some people are noticing that the comics are constantly being invoked. There's one children's writer who received letters where people were asking him, "So you've seen the actual comics? Can they really be as bad as these stories say? I mean, can we really assume that Americans want to destroy their children, right? Can these comics really be quite as bad?" So clearly people were noticing something, but again, it's interesting that ambivalence that this can't be right. I mean, they can't all be so irredeemably bad because it would make no sense that another country would do this to their own children. Other children, sure, right, but not, not necessarily to their own children. And so so that's one sort of area where we see this kind of breakdown. In the Soviet case, we see the prominent cultural figures in the state being able to find common ground on this particular issue. Obviously, in the United States, it's a much more complicated issue where you have lots of different groups involved, and as a result, it's not quite clear what the common ground is. Right? You have public organizations, parents, independent organizations, religious organizations. Lots and lots of people are involved in different in different capacities. Both blame comics for social problems, but the consequences are different, right? In the United States, the concern is that this is kind of an unfortunate outcome of maybe kind of unfettered capitalism, and whether or not this will lead children towards an authoritarian regime. Of course, in the Soviet Union, the concern is that this is going to destroy socialism and communism and take them to the depravity, to depraved society like the United States. So what do we make of this relatively brief episode where the two superpowers seem to be in agreement on one particular issue? Well, for the United States, obviously the comics were abandoned in favor of other things that needed to be worried about, right? Television, music, video games, internet, perhaps the list can be continued depending on, iPads, various other things. In the Soviet Union, comics remained a symbol of American culture and American cultural depravity, right? And the reflection of this continued fear of commercialism and the fear of the role that popular taste, bad taste, potentially has on culture. So who became like who, right? Was it the United States that was becoming like the Soviet Union on this issue? Was it is this an indication of the common roots of modern regimes, kind of the dark side of democracy? Is it that both superpowers, being modern industrialized societies, regardless of their political structures, found themselves facing similar challenges? What's interesting is that there's a key difference. Both, of course, had access to a full range of tools, right, from permissiveness to repression. But ultimately, in the United States, most were not comfortable utilizing the full range of options, right? In large part because of the concerns that they would become too much like the Soviet Union. And so it's an interesting reminder of the sort of the nice thing about the Cold War, right? Where the fear of becoming like the Soviet Union, the attacks on individual freedoms, violations of privacy, and so on, kept the United States government from going too far permanently in that particular direction. Something that perhaps makes us miss the Cold War in its own special way. I want to add kind of three smaller points. The first one is I want to very briefly go back to Wortham, right? I mean, again, it's easy to depict him as somebody quite ridiculous, and of course, part of the problem is that most people who write about him are people who are fans of comic books, and they see him as kind of the classic villain in the destruction of their favorite medium, and the medium that perhaps has remained marginalized since that time. And for the most part, people are remembering the good comics and not not the other ones that he was so concerned about, kind of the racist, the imperialist, the misogynist, the images where you could find images that you would not be able to see in any other medium. And in fact, in 1949, the U.S. Army banned the sale of comic books on its basis, concerned about the material was too gruesome for soldiers, right? So the idea that it's a problem on the U.S. basis, but continues to be sold, to anybody who has a nickel or or a dime. The other interesting thing is kind of noting the other things that Wortham was involved in. He often took unpopular public stands on important issues, right? I already mentioned the free clinic he operated in Harlem. He also argued against segregation because he saw it as damaging. Basically, the problem with him, I mean, and part of why he is depicted in this light, is that he was arguing for impact of social causes, right? For social problems. It's not purely individual. It's not the fact that each child, as an individual, made the wrong choice. But rather the concern that basically, that in the case of comic books, he's criticizing companies that are making huge profits at the expense potentially of mental health of children. And again, kind of in the grand narrative of the Cold War, right, the emphasis on social causes rather than the power of the individual is seen as potentially problematic. But of course, behind the seeming silliness of putting comics on trial, there are obviously some very serious issues that in many ways continue to be discussed in our contemporary society, right? What is the impact of violence and cultural products on those who consume those products? right? It's not really about comics anymore so much. But of course, the debates about movies and cartoons and video games and the internet, right? I mean, it points to the cyclical nature of these discussions and the fact that they haven't really been satisfactorily addressed. The last thing that I want to note, kind of bringing it since we're already in the present with this concern, sort of two fun stories about comic books today. In post-Soviet Russia, there's some indication that some have realized the potential value of comics as a way to reach a younger audience, and in particular, a wealthy man who realized that young people today don't know their World War II heroes anymore has decided to kind of fund a comic book version of these very very famous Soviet-era heroic stories as a way to reach a new audience. He was concerned because, when there was some contest about drawing these heroes, the kids drew them as sort of, the women all had physiques like the ones you saw on those images. The boys all had huge biceps, and so he became concerned. And so there's this idea that perhaps using this Western, slightly problematic medium as a way to actually restore the memory of Soviet heroism. In the United States, there's a renewed concern, or at least in the last couple of years, concern about the problems with comic books. In particular, there was a white paper published by Michael Medved and Michael Lackner called "The Betrayal of Captain America." And the problem with these comics is that several major comic books today actively promote a destructive cynicism and mistrust of the U.S. government at a time when America faces a strong-willed enemy sworn to our destruction. The comics promote an epidemic of self-doubt and self-hate. They dare to express an ambivalence on the war on terror, and they dare even question certain aspects of American history, like, for example, the heroic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to help end triumphantly World War II. And so as a way to combat that, a comic book, here it is. A comic book was issued in 2005 to help deal with this problem, an alternative version of history, and this is Liberality for All. And I don't know if you can read the comments, but basically it's obviously Osama bin Laden who's thanking, here it is. I would like to take a moment to personally thank the UN Secretary General Jacques Chirac for his part in the peace negotiations. I would like to thank Vice President Moore and President Clinton, or as I have come to know them, Michael and Madam Chelsea. If it were not for American leaders like them, I would not be here today. So, I mean, despite the fact that one can make an argument that perhaps comic books have become slightly irrelevant in culture wars, it appears that that may not actually be the case.
Basically in the early 90s, there was a move away from the Comics Code Authority, and by the end of the decade it had basically fallen apart. Do you think that might be related to the fall of the Soviet Union and a lack of need for it then, or is that unrelated?
I mean, I was afraid that somebody would ask me like a straight up U.S. comic book question. I mean, I think I would, as a non-American historian, I would say that I think probably not. I would say it has much more to do with internal development in the industry, right? I mean, I think that there's a general move. I mean, the development of comics. I mean, one of the things that happened was that with the comic code and kind of the return to fuzzy, cuddly, animals for small children, you also saw the development of adult comics. And I don't mean adult comics like the ones I showed earlier, but like ones that have kind of serious satirical message, so providing social critique. I mean, kind of stuff like that, right? And so those, or even, I guess maybe the most famous example, Mad Magazine, right? Who, of course, in some of their earlier issues had a field day with Wortham, making kind of ridiculing him and making fun of him. So it seems like the issues that this is a genre that's kind of working through its own issues. And in many ways, the Soviet Union is not the most relevant, or Russia for that matter, is not the most relevant for them. The interesting thing is that there's an effort kind of to create Russian comics, in the 1990s and early 2000s, and they're also sort of more not the cuddly animals, but kind of these very interesting artistic endeavors. And of course, they are completely, they're not being mass produced, they're not being mass bought, because again, this is no longer the American cultural product that the people in Russia are interested in, right? There are lots of things are, but the comics are just kind of not it. Professor Schuster?
You might have just kind of answered it right there. My question was going to be, to what extent, if you look at American political cartoons in the 19th century, 18th century, heck, the comic, motif is always there. You have a figure, and there's usually a bubble, and they're saying something like, you crass royalist Jew. Now, did Russia have such a? So they did have such a.
Oh yeah, there are two ways to answer this question. I mean, one is that there was for people who are fans of comic books, there was an effort to try to demonstrate that this is not an alien concept in Russia, that it was always there, and there are these sort of chap books, kind of published for for peasants, where it's like chapbooks, right? Pictures, and so it's sort of like it's sort of like a comic book. I mean, but. There were some political cartoons that were, again, sort of when you're trying to reach a largely illiterate population and explain something more complicated than that involves more than one message. It almost looks like a comic, right, where the worker kills the bourgeoisie or repeatedly, right, over a span of time. They also have political cartoons, and political cartoons in the Soviet Union are highly highly cultivated. I think. For the Soviets, they don't see comic books, right, as a literary genre. They see it as kind of pulp fiction and trash. And the Soviet cultural elite and political elite are opposed to pulp fiction of any origin, native and foreign, right? So this is kind of, it's problematic on multiple levels, right? It's problematic for being seen as low culture and trash. It's problematic from coming from the United States, and it's problematic for the messages that it is seen as as showing.
I guess my other question would be, in the United States, was there, after they came out with these comic codes, was there kind of an underground developed, and were there any efforts within the United States to repress that, or to suppress a kind of comic underground?
The beauty of suppression in the United States is that, capitalism kind of takes care of a lot of things for you on that front, right? So, and this is a very important thing, that there were people, even Wortham didn't actually want censorship. All he wanted was, these things not to be sold to 5-year-olds, right? If the parent wants to buy it for them, and he even said that, if a father of a 7-year-old says, I would like my child to learn how to rape and maim, they have a right to buy them that book. But a 7-year-old doesn't get to go to the store and say, I would like to buy, this particular book. So, it seems that line, you're going to have some people kind of among the general public who might be perhaps the ones who are organizing the burnings. But in general, you don't really have government officials or cultural figures saying, we want censorship, because I think that they were not willing to go, to go that far. Part of the problem is, with television, and there's also sort of the antitrust, some antitrust issues, which means that some of these comic companies publishing companies had to break down, and so they had, the costs went up, and their networks were more complicated, and so there were a number of factors that contributed to the decline of the comics books. It's easy to say that it was, damn Wortham, but really there are a number of other kind of much more powerful factors. And when the underground develops, right, it never really, underground comics, right, they never really become part of mass culture. Right? I think we can argue whether it's pop culture or not, right? But they're definitely not mass culture, right? Because most people don't read them, right? Because they are not, if they want satire, people who are interested in satire probably are going to read it in some other forum, right? People who want comics are going to get their kittens and puppies, or or the hordes of old ones that they haven't destroyed. So there isn't. The kind of the censorship issue is a very sensitive one in the United States, at least as long as the Cold War was going on.
Well, you get in the 1960s, you have the rise of Crumb and the real counterculture comics, and it's that venue where our comics are already marginal, right? Only kids read it, etc., and then it has the whole stigma attached in the late 40s, 50s. But by the 60s, it's like you can get away with stuff in there that you couldn't get away with on film. Fritz the Cat could never have been made into a film if it wasn't a comic first.
But most people, but it has a very small audience, right? It has a kind of a fan. People are fans, but it doesn't have the same mass audience that the earlier comics had.
It's a subculture.
Right.
kind of curious, since the comic books were not all that readily available in the Soviet Union, how could they actually use them so effectively in saying this is part of the reason for the decline of culture in the United States, and it will happen here if we accept these Western ideas?
The beauty of the Soviet system is that you don't actually have to read something to know that it's deeply problematic. This is sort of the mantra, right? I have not read this book, but I know that this book is deeply problematic by virtue of coming from the United States, by virtue of being about these particular subjects. However, I will say that I'm pretty sure that some of these cultural figures actually had seen them. You know, there were a couple articles where they reprinted. I mean, the ones that they reprinted, there was a very famous one where a little girl is saying basically saying that she didn't like her parents because they were poor, but she had this aunt and she was really rich, so she killed her dad. She framed her mom for it and her mom's boyfriend. Her mom and her mom's boyfriend were put on the electric chair and executed, and she now gets to live in this happy home. And so this was one of those comics. It was that was reprinted in the article actually, and kind of as an example of kind of the utter depravity of, you know, everything that America stands for, right? Because you're glorifying, I mean, a full range of things, starting from capital punishment and sort of consumer goods, right? And the fact that she did it all for money, right? The reason that she killed her parent, you know, one of her parents, framed the other, got them executed, was all so she could have a better, more comfortable life, right? I mean, it captures everything, right, that you can possibly imagine being wrong with America.
Well, let's give her a round of applause, please.